All right, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Dan Morley Boxing Podcast. Last week I wasn't here because I did an interview with Grassroots Boxing, basically about my comeback, and the comeback is in full swing now. Medicals have been done, brain scans been done, license has been renewed. So yeah, buzzing. I'm hoping to be out, hopefully, within the next 3 months, making my return. That'll be my 9th pro fight. Training is well underway, getting myself fit, feeling all of the knocks and the bumps and bruises after a couple of years out, but feeling fit, feeling sharp and feeling strong. I will be able to announce my comeback as soon as all of that stuff is sorted. And yeah, as I say, I'm kind of eyeing up sometime within the next 3 months. But yeah, buzzing, getting there, getting my fitness back and keeping all of this stuff ticking along as well. So today I'm going to be covering quite a subject that I'm fascinated with. I'm fascinated with all of the subjects I cover, to be honest with you, otherwise I wouldn't do them. But this one in particular, because it kind of piques my interest to the max, because I love every era of boxing. I love comparing the eras, and I love seeing who was the best from each, kind of weighing them up, who is the greatest of all time, all of that. So what I'm going to be doing today is basically naming the greatest fighter from each decade, from 1910 all the way to present day. I'll even give the 2020s a go. It's a little bit harder with the 2020s because obviously we're 4 years in. So yeah, 4.5 years in, let's say, from 2020. But I'll give it a go, and I'll give a little prediction as to who I think may be the 2020 fighter of the decade. So this is only going to cover the boxers' work that they've done across the 10 years, if that makes sense. So from 1910 to 1919, obviously including the whole of 1910. So that is a 10-year span. All the way up to present day. I'm not necessarily going to cover earlier than that. You have got the 1890s, which, you know, I'll give a good shout out to Bob Fitzsimmons, who ultimately became boxing's first 3-division champion from middleweight to heavyweight. English guy, maybe the greatest English fighter ever. Very strong puncher. He would probably be my pick for the 1890s. And 1900s, again, I won't go into any detail, but I'll give the great lightweight American Joe Gans a shout, who dominated the division for around 7 years, I believe, off the top of my head, and was just phenomenal. Using tricks 120 years ago that are still being used today, it's just mind-blowing. But those are my picks for those two decades. As I say, I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I want to dig into these ones here. Starting from 1910 all the way to present day, my greatest boxer across each decade. Let's go. Starting with the 1910s. So from 1910 to 1919, there were a few. I mean, obviously Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world across this time. A huge figure in boxing. Absolutely unbelievable what he had to overcome, the oppression he was forced to deal with and overcome, his ability as a defensive boxer at the time, which you might look with hindsight and be like, God, he looks awful. But, you know, we're talking 110 years ago. This was pretty phenomenal stuff, the way he was able to move, where most guys would just stand still and slug. He was obviously a very, very legendary heavyweight champion, but I'm not going to pick him in my 1910s fighter of the decade because there's someone I think that is more accomplished. And it isn't Benny Leonard, who was, again, you're talking about Joe Gans as a great lightweight. Benny Leonard, the ghetto wizard, was potentially the second greatest lightweight of all time. But he held the title as the greatest lightweight of all time for around 50 years before Roberto Duran came along. And many people will consider Leonard as having potentially the greatest ring IQ ever, beat an array of Hall of Famers, took quite a lot of losses early in his career. I think he had, off the top of my head, anywhere from about 70 to 100 fights by the time he was 20 years old. But he would only lose a couple more times in the next 100 or so fights as he reigned for 7 years as lightweight champion. Just such a brilliant fighter. I'll put some clips over here on the YouTube video. You'll just see, like, this is a guy from the 1910s, and he looks like a modern-day fighter. It's unbelievable. He also used to shoot at the great Gene Tunney, give Gene Tunney advice, you know, on how to fight and how to box. Another fighter that used his brain to outpoint people rather than to outpunch them. But Leonard was amazing. Had well over 70 knockouts as well. unbelievable. But even the great Benny Leonard isn't going to take my pick, because my 1910 fighter of the decade is Sam Langford, who, ironically, I talk about Sam Langford all the time. He never won a world title in any weight division. However, we talk about the 1900s greatest fighter of the decade, 1900 to 1909, in Joe Gans. Langford beat Gans as a teenager at lightweight. He beat him, but unfortunately the title wasn't on the line. In the 1900s as well, because you could give Sam Langford a shout for one of the greatest fighters in the decade before, and maybe even a decade after, but 1910s is no doubt. He beat young Peter Jackson, who was the welterweight champion back then as well in the 1900s, and got a draw where he was clearly robbed against Barbados Joe Walcott, who was considered the greatest welterweight champion of all time. And this is before the 1910s have even started. However, in the 1910s, he had a record. Let me just have a look at my notes here just to make sure I get it right. So from 1910 to 1919, he had a record of 81 wins to 23 defeats and 14 draws, roughly. His record is quite unofficial because he had a lot of fights. But of the ones I counted when I looked for his record, he had 50 knockouts. Langford is still regarded as the second hardest puncher in boxing history by the Ring magazine, behind Joe Louis. Basically, after beating the greatest lightweight of all time in Joe Gans and the greatest welterweight of all time in Barbados Joe Walcott in the 1900s, across the 1910s he would move up and absolutely slaughter the greatest middleweight of all time at the time in Stanley Ketchel. He'd then move up and knock out the light heavyweight world champion Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. It's also worth noting in the 1900s as well, shortly after fighting the lightweight and welterweight champion, he fought Jack Johnson, the heavyweight champion. And although he didn't beat Jack Johnson, he went the distance with him. Now, Langford has the second most victories against Hall of Famers in history. I can't actually remember off the top of my head how many, but I believe it might be about 14 and 15. He obviously boxed, the great Stanley Ketchel middleweight, but also boxed the great Tiger Flowers and beat him in the 1910s. He is most well known for his legendary run against heavyweights such as Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Harry Wills, where he famously boxed some of these guys up to 20 times. Now, you have to bear in mind, this is a lightweight who beat the greatest lightweight of all time, fighting the top heavyweights 15, 10, 12, 20 times. He knocked every single one of them out. They are all Hall of Famers that weren't able to get a shot due to the colour of their skin and the racism at the time. Langford was unbelievable. He basically, in modern terms, boxed from lightweight to heavyweight and destroyed everyone. It's never been mimicked. It's never come close. The only one that's surpassed that with weight divisions travelled is Georges Carpentier, who obviously boxed from flyweight all the way up to heavyweight, which is just a joke. He actually boxed Jack Dempsey in boxing's first ever $1 million gate fight, which, at heavyweight, considering he was a flyweight when he turned pro. But yeah, my 1910s fighter of the year has got to be Sam Langford. He's arguably a top five fighter of all time, and famously known as the greatest fighter that no one knows. So my 1910 to 1919 fighter of the decade is the great Sam Langford, which then takes me on to the 1920s. And again, this is a tough one because Benny Leonard was still on a bit of a run in the 1920s. But there's one man that's going to win it. And this man arguably did some of his best work in the 1910s, similarly to Sam Langford, who done a lot of his best work in the 1900s. And my 1920s fighter of the decade is the legendary Harry Greb, arguably the greatest boxer to ever lace up a pair of gloves. Absolutely crazy fighter. Greb, he was in pretty good form going into the 1920s because in 1919, the year before, he went 45-0 in that year alone, defeating a whole string of Hall of Famers. Going into 1920, he would lose just once in his first 64 fights, which means, taking that 45-0 into account, he suffered one loss in over 100 fights in 2 to 3 years or 3 to 4 years, which is just crazy stuff. He was fighting casually from welterweight all the way up to heavyweight. He was around the middleweight. But during that streak, during those fights, he was the only man to beat the great heavyweight champion Gene Tunney, despite being a middleweight. Gene Tunney would famously beat Jack Dempsey twice. Gene Tunney had 5 fights with Harry Greb. That is the level we're talking about with Harry Greb. But in 1923, Greb finally got his shot at the title, well over 200 fights into his career, where he beat Johnny Wilson and become the middleweight champion of the world. He had legendary fights against the great welterweight champion Mickey Walker that's said to potentially be the most brutal middleweight title fight in history. Greb beat Walker, as he would also beat the great Tiger Flowers, another Hall of Fame middleweight who, similarly to Greb, and Walker, over 100 years after their, in Greb and Flowers' case, their death, but, their career, they're still considered in the top. Greb, maybe 3 of all time, Walker, top 30 of all time, and Flowers in the top 50 boxers of all time. Greb was just a joke. He obviously beat the likes of Tommy Loughran multiple times, battling Levinsky, Mike McTeague. These are just all names of Hall of Famers off the top of my head that he beat in the 1920s. His record across the 1920s until his retirement in 1926, so over a 6-year period, was 114 wins to 8 defeats, 5 draws with just 23 knockouts, which makes it even more impressive considering he was beating a load of the top heavyweights at the time. Throughout this entire run, he was completely blind in one eye. He would sadly pass away at just 32, a couple of months after his final fight against the legendary Tiger Flowers. He had 300 fights, only lost about 20 times, lost once in 100 fights at his absolute best in the 20s, and is just such a phenomenal fighter. And lived a crazy lifestyle as well, it's worth mentioning. Like, he wasn't your standard disciplined fighter. He was a nutcase. He loved the drink, he loved the women, he loved trouble, and he sadly passed away from a no surgery gone wrong at 32 years old, after potentially honing the greatest legacy any boxer's ever produced. It's also worth noting that his 16 Hall of Famers defeated has never been surpassed by any boxer before or since. He defeated more Hall of Famers than anyone in history. Which then takes me on to the 1930s, which is dominated really by one man, the legendary Henry Armstrong, who I have always had as the second greatest boxer of all time. And hopefully within the next couple of minutes, I can explain to you why. Because his legacy was imprinted in the 1930s. He had a record, if I look at my notes here, of 104 wins with 13 defeats and 7 draws and 69 KOs just across that decade. But in his prime, he was unbelievable. He may well have gone on the greatest run in boxing history during this time. For a couple of years, Armstrong went 59-1-1 with 51 knockouts. Now, that is impressive anyway. You look at fighters' careers today, fighters' records today. I don't know, let's use Canelo, for instance, who has had about 60-plus fights, a couple of losses, and people will say it's a legendary career. Armstrong, this is just his prime. He had over 100 knockouts, let alone 100 fights, going 59-1-1. This was during his legendary 3-division title run, which, as I always say, it might not sound that amazing in the current scheme of things in today's context, but he basically dominated everyone, including Hall of Famers like Lou Ambers, Barney Ross, P.T. Saron, Baby Arizmendi, Benny Bass. Similarly, he owns amongst the highest wins of Hall of Famers in history. But he basically dominated all of those guys from featherweight all the way up to middleweight, which, if you do that in today's standards, isn't 3-weight divisions, it's 7-weight divisions. But what makes this more impressive than anything, Manny Pacquiao did 8 divisions, but Armstrong did this all at the same time. He simultaneously held these belts. So he won the featherweight world title, the lightweight world title, and the welterweight world title, and defended that successfully 19 times, which close to 100 years later is still the record, and I can't see it being broken anytime soon. It's also worth noting as well that he faced off against the middleweight champion Seferino Garcia, a Filipino fighter. He beat him, and then would face him for the middleweight world title where he'd be robbed blind. So really, he should have been a 4-division champion at that time when there were only 8-weight divisions in the sport. It's just phenomenal. He never took a step backwards. All of his opponents were bigger than him. He got 27 knockouts in a row during that streak, which is just crazy. He was probably the greatest inside fighter of all time. You know, what you got to bear in mind is this is over like a 3-4 year stretch. This is a featherweight fighting middleweights and knocking them out with ease. Hall of Fame middleweights, welterweights. Just simply phenomenal. He was just perpetual motion, just pure aggression, constantly slipping. He used to have his hands here as well, if you can see me on the screen, just down by his chest. But he would lean on fighters. He'd bob and weed, ride shots. There is also, you know, he also famously boxed Sugar Ray Robinson well past his prime. And, you know, it's a bit of a cash grab, really. Robinson, you know, he was Robinson's idol, one of his idols. Robinson wanted him to earn some money. But, you know, I've always think that's pretty cool that the number one and number two boxer of all time actually shared a ring. There's no footage of that fight, as there's no footage of Robinson in his prime. But there are pictures of it. And, yeah, I think that's legendary. But, yeah, 1930s fighter of the decade is Henry Armstrong in my eyes, which, you know, takes me on to the 1940s where there's two that you could pick. This was Joe Louis's decade of dominance, you know, where he basically dominated the entire heavyweight division, you know, becoming arguably the greatest heavyweight to ever live. And in any other decade, he would be the fighter of the decade, without question. But you're sharing that with a prime Sugar Ray Robinson, who from 1940 to 1949 had a record, looking down here on my nose, if I can find it, of 101 wins to just one defeat with over 60 knockouts and 2 draws. This is Robinson, his absolute peak. You know, in his early days, defeating fighters like Sammy Angot, who beat a prime Willie Pep, Jake LaMotta 4 times, Kid Gavilan twice, Henry Armstrong, as previously mentioned, although Armstrong was past his best, Fritzy Zivic twice. You know, these, I believe Henry Brim as well. These are all Hall of Famers. He went on his massive 91 fight unbeaten streak during this time. He would actually move up to middleweight in the 1950s, where he would continue this unbeaten streak. But yeah, Robinson, like, you know, I mean, look at the record. From 1940 to 1949, where he turned pro in 1940, 101 wins to 1 defeat, like, and over 60 knockouts. It's just crazy. That's just crazy because he was consistently boxing the best fighters in the world. You know, there's a reason they called Sugar Ray Robinson the greatest fighter of all time. And this is it, because he could punch, he could box, he could move. He was practically unbeatable. He was never stopped in this run here. He was only ever stopped once in his career, which did happen in the 1950s, but only due to heat exhaustion in a fight he was in complete control of. You know, probably the most perfect fighter ever produced in the 1940s. Sadly, there's no footage of him, but from the footage we can see of his later days, where he looks unbelievable, and there's plenty of fights out there, you can't even imagine how good he was in his prime. You know, the footage that's available of him is when he started to take losses, you know, and he still looks phenomenal. He still looks like one of the greatest to ever box. Imagine seeing him in his prime. It would be terrifying stuff. So, in my opinion, he is my 1940s fighter of the decade, with Joe Louis just coming behind. Any other decade, he would have absolutely smashed it, because he was 12 years unbeaten from the late 30s, you know. But taking it into the 1950s, where I've got my notes over here, again, I'm going to go with Sugar Ray Robinson, because the 1950s, you had Rocky Marciano, but he wasn't active for, you know, a great deal of that. Like almost half of the decade he was retired. You also have Archie Moore, who could definitely have a shout, because, you know, a phenomenal light heavyweight champion during this time. But Robinson was involved in so many of the fight of the years. He became a 5-time middleweight champion in this decade. And he had a record of 42-5-1 with 23 knockouts across this decade, which still is unbelievable. But, you know, I think the 40s is his decade of dominance without a shadow of a doubt. That's where he's obviously cemented as the greatest of all time. But the 50s is where he really becomes the greatest of all time, because although he does suffer those 5 defeats, he avenges every single one of them. So he would have lost to Randolph Turpin, which ultimately was his second career loss, and he avenged it instantly. He lost to Carmen Basilio, avenged it. Gene Fullmer avenged it with potentially the greatest left hook that's ever been thrown. He went for a bid for the light heavyweight title against Joey Maxim, and 13 rounds in a fight that was so hot that even the referee had to be replaced. Up on the cards against the much bigger man, considering Robertson has started beating the greatest featherweights of all time, or of the era, let's say. He passed out due to heat exhaustion and didn't become the light heavyweight champion. In the 12-round era, he would have been champion from basically featherweight to light heavyweight. But, that was one of his losses there. But, he also beat great fighters like Bobo Olsen twice. Rocky Graziano, Rocky Castellani. It's an unbelievable record. And these are some of the most brutal fights ever. Obviously, his wins against Jake LaMotta, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which is arguably the most vicious beating of the decade. Robinson is the only fighter in this list to be fighter of the decade twice. And that is a testament to why he is the greatest fighter of all time. You have his decade of dominance, where he's absolutely untouchable. And then the ones where he's still beating these guys, but taking a few losses. But you don't want to beat him because he'll come back and beat you. A 5-time middleweight champion of the world, 1950s and 1940s fighter of the decade is Sugar Ray Robinson. Which, moving on to the 1960s, I'm just going to go straight in and give it to Muhammad Ali, who across the time had a record of 29-0 with 22 knockouts. Now, Ali completely revolutionized the game in the heavyweight division. And his resume during that time is practically, it's insane. Obviously, the 70s is where he really got the big names, the Frasers, the Foremans. Those are his biggest names. The Shavers, I wouldn't say as big. But this is where he really burst onto the scene. No one trash talks like Muhammad Ali, firstly. But no one moved like Muhammad Ali. Gene Tunney used to move in the 20s, 40 years earlier, completely revolutionary heavyweight. But no one threw punches and moved like Muhammad Ali in the 60s. His performance against Cleveland Williams, who was an absolutely devastating puncher, is considered the greatest boxing performance ever. He obviously beat the terrifying Sonny Liston twice. He beat Henry Cooper twice in this time. He beat George Savallo, Floyd Patterson. He was just a complete icon as well during this time. I mean, he wasn't actually necessarily liked early on. He would become more of an icon towards the 70s. But, when you break down his resume, the performances, his fame, for a heavyweight champion, the way he was piquing interest in the sport with his personality, the charisma, predicting the rounds with the poems, and the resume, of course, it's pretty phenomenal. He was undefeated. We actually had 3 years of this decade robbed of him because he refused to go to Vietnam, which again, when you look at how he beat Ernie Sorrell and how he beat Cleveland Williams around that time, man, like seeing a prime Muhammad Ali, it's pretty crazy. And, Ali wasn't like a crazy puncher. He's never deemed as one of the greatest punchers of all time because he wasn't. But I was thinking about this the other day. When you actually look at who he stopped, he has all-time great punchers, knockout wins, if that makes sense. Like, he has the resume of an all-time puncher. He obviously stopped Foreman. But no one else stopped Foreman. Obviously, it wasn't due to his power. It's due to his tactics and exhaustion. But he stopped Frazier. Again, not a knockout, but he still stopped him. He stopped Liston twice. Henry Cooper. Similarly, all of these aren't one-punch knockouts. But if you had a fighter now that stopped all of them fighters, that's kind of like an all-time great puncher's record, considering Ali was a mover. I'm pretty certain he stopped Patterson as well. He stopped Ron Lyle, loads of top fighters. Just an unbelievable fighter. 1960s, I can't see anyone beating the Muhammad Ali that absolutely schooled Cleveland Williams. So fast, so fluid. And, although he was dropped a few times in the 60s, we found out in the 70s how tough he was and how phenomenal his chin was. Just such a complete fighter. Arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time. In my opinion, he is, when you break down the resume as well. But yeah, 1960s fighter of the decade for me is the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali. Which then takes me on to 1970s, where you would probably have guessed that it's not Muhammad Ali, because I've already said that no fighter other than Robinson has the win for 2 consecutive decades, or 2 decades. If you have it in 2 decades and not consecutive, then fair play, because that's a 30-year span. But it isn't Muhammad Ali, because although he was the biggest icon of the 70s, and you can 1,000,000% make a case that he was the greatest fighter of the 70s. I don't think he was. He obviously scored the wins against Frazier, Shavers, Lyle, Foreman, those legendary fights. Ken Norton as well, the whole trilogy there. But he was a little bit more vulnerable, and obviously towards the end of it, he completely slowed down. So I don't think you can give him the Fighter of the Decade award purely because there are other fighters that were absolutely on fire. One of those is Carlos Monzon, who was completely undefeated across the decade. Haven't actually written this in my notes, but I've covered Carlos Monzon and this decade in a series before on Instagram. And if I remember rightly, he was 25-0 across that decade with, I believe, 15 world title wins at middleweight. And he had basically crushed the entire middleweight division for just over 7 years, if I'm not mistaken, or around 7 years. A really terrifying man. Defeated top middleweights like Nino Benvenuti, blasted him away twice. Jose Naples, who was one of the great welterweights moving up. Emil Griffith, who was one of the greatest fighters of all time. Rodrigo Valdez, Tony Mundine. Monzon was a beast. But not my 1970s fighter of the decade, because that goes to the hands of stone. Roberto Duran, who, oh man, like this decade, right, may well be the greatest decade a boxer's produced. And I might have to be a little bit, play with the dates a little bit here, because it's probably an 11-year span where this comes in. But from 1970 to 1979, Duran had 55 fights and won 54. His sole defeat was to the great Esteban de Jesus, a man who had many legendary fights, and Duran avenged those defeats twice. He would defeat the legendary featherweight champion Ernesto Marcel in 1970, Ken Buchanan for the title a couple of years later, who was a Hall of Fame-worthy fighter. Top fighters in the lightweight division, like the Viruet brothers, Edwin and Adolfo Viruet. He basically just cleaned out the division for 7 years. There seems to be a theme with great fighters being in a division, ruling it for 7 years. I've noticed I've said that quite a lot. But Duran was just untouchable in this decade defensively. His sole defeat was avenged twice. He ruled that division with menace. He is the greatest lightweight of all time, without a doubt. And he would move up in the late 70s to welterweight, which you think today fighters jump in divisions is pretty common, but it's a 12-pound jump. It's basically 2 divisions today. He went from 35 to 47 and schooled the Hall of Fame champion Carlos Palomino in one of his greatest career performances. And then obviously in 1980, he beat Sugar Ray Leonard in his prime, which again, going from beating the greatest featherweight, beating everyone else, scoring tons and tons of knockouts, and then beating a prime Leonard. I think that is up there as one of the greatest decades ever produced, because he was so aggressive. He was like the devil in the ring. He was the hands of stone. He wanted to absolutely tear his opponents apart, but he was so crafty as well, so defensively sound. So many great fighters learn their stuff from Duran. And it's one that the more casual fans don't realise, because they see Leonard picking him off in the rematch when he's bloated and, late notice, all of that. Still a great performance by Leonard, by the way, the No Mass incident. But Duran in the 70s, in his prime, serious fighter. Actually had a record of 72-1 with 50-something knockouts after beating the prime Sugar Ray Leonard. So 1970s fighter of the decade is, in my opinion, Roberto Duran, which then takes me on to the 1980s, where this is a tough one because there's a lot of great fighters. You've obviously got Chavez, who was tearing the 80s up, Alexis Arguello, Aaron Pryor, Tommy Hearns, who none of those guys are my top pick for the decade, although they are phenomenal fighters. Mike Tyson burst on the scene. Evander Holyfield smashed the cruiserweights, and Larry Holmes dominated the heavyweights. It may well be the most stacked division in history, decade in history across the divisions. But it's either between Marvin Hagler or Sugar Ray Leonard, and I've always veered with Sugar Ray Leonard because I do feel like he beat Hagler. I wouldn't be begrudged if you think it's Hagler. Those fights against Mugabe, Hearns were just legendary. He obviously ruled the division again for 7 years at middleweight, roughly, making those 12 defenses with 11 knockouts. successfully. But for me, Leonard, he beat everyone. You know, he obviously beat Wilfred Benitez the year before in 1979. But, you know, although he lost to a prime Roberto Duran, he gave one of the greatest performances of all time in what you could consider a top 3 greatest fight of all time in that brawl in Montreal. The rematch, he absolutely schooled Duran. It's a clinic. You know, there's so many external factors that go into that fight. You know, it's just fights like clutch moments like the Tommy Hearns fight, the first one. Now, I don't think he deserved the rematch. I don't. But the first fight, to stop him in that fashion is seriously impressive stuff. And I do feel like he beat Hagler as well. I do feel like he just nicked it. I feel like Hagler gave away the early rounds. And I don't feel like Leonard's work was ineffective. I don't think he was ever going to hurt Hagler. So I think it's an unfair thing to judge him off. I think you could give it to Hagler, but I do feel like in beating Duran, Hearns, Hagler, and of course Donnie Lalonde for the light heavyweight crown, Ayub Kaluli as well, a few decent fighters in there, and of course that savage knockout against Davey Boy Green, I would veer with Leonard, who went 10-1-1 across that decade. It's a tough one. You could definitely give it to Hagler, who had the legendary fights as well, but it's whatever you pick. For me, it's between... Oh, didn't mean to knock the mic. For me, it's between Hagler and Leonard, and I'm just going to side with Leonard. But I'm running out of time now, so I'm going to fly through these next ones. 1990s. I mean, man, it's Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr. was untouchable in this time. I believe, off the top of my head, I need to get this up on my phone, actually, because I don't want to get this one wrong. Across the 1990s, he was 40-1, his record. His one defeat was a disqualification loss to Montel Griffin, which he instantly avenged in the first round. He was just a joke. He was like a cheat code in the 90s. He was pretty unbelievable. He obviously had those wins against Hopkins and Tony, but dominated the middleweight division and the super middleweight division, even moving up to dominate the light heavyweights. 1990s Roy Jones Jr. is the most athletic fighter I've ever seen. He had power, speed, one of the fastest fighters I've ever seen. Amazing defensive instincts. I wouldn't say he was the best defensive fighter because he used to use his athleticism rather than defensive skills. Still an amazing defensive fighter because if it works, it works. Obviously, caught up to him when he slowed down after his moving down from heavyweight. But 1990s Roy Jones Jr. is basically unprecedented. It's unmatched since, really. I've never seen a fighter that good. Had he have retired after beating Ruiz with a record of, if I just double check here, 48-1. You know, he's matching Marciano, basically undefeated across 49 fights. Middleweight to heavyweight champion. I think he could have a rightful claim as the greatest of all time. Sadly, he did go on a bit too long. Well, sadly, he went on way too long, let's be real. But yeah, phenomenal fighter. And my pick for the 90s fighter of the decade. Which then takes me to 2000, where I'm going to go with the Pac-Man, Manny Pacquiao, who blasted through his weight divisions here, compiled a record of 23-1-2 with 20 knockouts across this decade. Now, there's always that famous line where Jim Lampley can't pronounce his name when he's fighting Lelo Ledwaba on short notice, where Pacquiao really burst onto the scene. But, man, did he burst onto the scene. He absolutely blasted Ledwaba. And then the reason I would pick Pacquiao over Mayweather in this instance is obviously the weight division run. You know, in total, he done 8 weight divisions, which most of them he covered in here. He also skipped 2 divisions. So really, he had all that success boxing from a 10 weight division span, which again, you're going back to like over a century where fighters had success doing that. No one does that in the modern era. But for me, although he did suffer just that one defeat of the decade to Erik Morales, I think it's those fights against the Mexicans that really cement this legacy as Pacquiao's, this decade as Pacquiao's. He would stop both Barrera and Morales in some seriously entertaining fights as well. He dropped Marquez about 4 times in the first 2 fights in this decade. Obviously beat Marquez as well. But just the way he blasted through Miguel Cotto, Ricky Hatton, Oscar De La Hoya, you know, it was pretty phenomenal. He was the fastest fighter I've ever seen with that knockout power, that really devastating knockout power. I think Leonard may have been faster, but Pacquiao was just terrifyingly fast in the 2000s. I slightly edged it to him over Floyd, who again was phenomenal across that decade. just because of the weight divisions Pacquiao run through, just because of all of those Hall of Famers he fought in, the Mexicans and Hatton and Cotto and De La Hoya. Yeah, I know Floyd fought a few of them as well, but really it's the Morales, Barrera and Marquez fights. Pacquiao is my 2000s fighter of the decade, which then takes me to the 2010s, where I'm going to go with Floyd Mayweather Jr. because Pacquiao and Mayweather were fighting for that pound for pound one slot in the 2000s. Pacquiao was pound for pound number one. Then Mayweather was pound for pound number one. Then Pacquiao, then Mayweather, then Pacquiao. And it shifted a lot. But in across the 2010s, for the first 5 or 6 years, it was Floyd all day. Floyd was the dominant force of the sport. Obviously had, beat Pacquiao. Although I would love to have seen that fight, same as everyone in the world, because neither of them were at their best. I would have loved to have seen that fight 3 or 4 years earlier. But, you've got those legendary names like Pacquiao and Canelo, like masterclass against Canelo. You can say what you want. Canelo was pretty young, pretty early on in his career. But, like no one has embarrassed Canelo like that since. It's obviously levels as well. A few other good fights as well. Obviously overcame Mosley, Berto, Guerrero, overcame Maidana. Obviously you've got the Conor McGregor one in there as well. Conor McGregor one in there as well. But yeah, I think the 2010s is Floyd's decade. I think we saw defense like we haven't seen for a very long time when Floyd was in that era. Obviously, Pretty Boy Floyd in the 2000s and even the 90s as well. He was, pretty frightening, very sharp defensively, very, very dangerous. But in the 2010s, he became Manny Mayweather, and he was just untouchable. His ring IQ and the way he would dominate fights is, pretty unbelievable. Pacquiao himself had a pretty good run as well, and actually went on right to the end of the decade. Being a world champion in the 2020s as well, boxing's only ever champion across 4 different decades. Canelo had a good run too. Roman Gonzalez had a good run too, but none of those guys surpassed Floyd Mayweather. Here's my 2010s fighter of the decade, which brings me up to date. It brings me up to now, where we are in 2024, and it's so hard to make a call on who the fighter of the decade is so far. You probably have Canelo, Usyk, Crawford, or Inoue. Take your pick. For me, off the top of my head, I believe Crawford's fought 4 times, similarly to Usyk. They both have the more standout victories against Anthony Joshua and Errol Spence. Canelo himself has fought 8 times, I believe, although suffering 1 defeat. And, his performances haven't been as telling. He hasn't been as dominant, although he did have that pretty incredible super middleweight run when he did defeat top names like Saunders and Plant and Callum Smith. But for me, I would probably say Inoue is my fighter of the decade so far, just because he's had 7 fights. He's boxed the likes of Jason Maloney. He's boxed the likes of Stephen Fulton, Tapales. He's gone undisputed in 2 divisions, and he's just the most active, and he's the most dominant along with Crawford. Usyk has shown signs of vulnerability with body shots. Canelo's obviously lost and showed those signs of vulnerability, which, he pushed himself, fair play. But it would be between Crawford and Inoue on the dominant spectrum. The fact that they've both become 2 division undisputed champions. And for me, the fact that Inoue's had 7 fights, it's just what takes it for me, the activity. Crawford himself has had 4 fights. He obviously has the standout win. But I think Inoue doing it in such quick succession as well and just absolutely blasting everyone is so far is my fighter of the decade so far. And when you actually look across the rest of the decade, you look at Crawford and Usyk's ages and Canelo, their age. Canelo looks like he may be showing signs of slowing down. Both Usyk and Crawford are in their mid to late 30s, whereas Inoue's only 31. And I think we've got at least a good 3-4 years left. So this could be Inoue's decade. The others are still going to stamp their legacy. If Usyk beats Fury, then, God, you'd probably say he is the fighter of the decade because he's got the biggest names on his resume so far. However, there's so many external factors. Great fighters. Those are my fighters of the decade across the last century. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Let me know what you want to see and share the podcast round. Thank you.